A retired Navy SEAL brought a Belgian Malinois puppy home through the October rain, tucking her inside his jacket to keep her from the cold. The next morning, her mother appeared outside the veterinary clinic, stared at the bundle in Barrett's arms for a long moment, then turned and ran east without looking back. Barrett thought the dog had given up on her puppy. He was wrong. Somewhere beyond the rail yards and the shuttered brick buildings, another small life was still waiting in the dark for the sound of its mother returning. And the truth would force Barrett to risk the one fragile thing he had only just learned to hold. Before this story goes any further, tell us what city you're watching from in the comments below, and subscribe to Paws of Courage for more stories of loyalty, resilience, and the bonds that find us when we need them most. Cold had settled over Knoxville early that October, dropping out of the Cumberland Plateau like a curtain being drawn across the season. The Tennessee River moved gray and silent below the viaducts, and the old neighborhoods off Magnolia wore their late autumn colors in wet silence. Barrett Fenn was driving back from a hardware run when he noticed movement in the narrow alley behind Kettleworth's building supply on Tazewell Pike. A small shape pressed against the base of a rusted drain pipe, trembling but not running. Barrett was 52, lean in the way that men become lean when they stop eating for comfort and start eating for function. He had fair skin weathered past its age, a short crop of silver-brown hair, and the habit of assessing a space before entering it. A reflex from 2 decades with naval special warfare that no amount of civilian time had loosened. His eyes were the color of slate after rain, and they rarely gave away what moved behind them. He had lived alone on Adair Drive for 3 years, and the house had learned to match him. Quiet, adequate, organized in a way that required no one else to maintain it. He parked at the end of the alley and left the truck door open. The puppy was a Belgian Malinois, 8 weeks old at most, with a dark fawn coat and a black mask that seemed too serious for a face so small. One ear stood straight, the other still folded at the tip. She was thin with the particular thinness of an animal burning energy just staying alive. Each time a car passed on the street, she pressed herself flatter against the drain pipe, then raised her head again to look toward the open end of the alley, as if expecting someone who had not arrived. Barrett crouched at the alley entrance and kept still. He had once waited motionless in a Kandahar culvert for 4 hours. Waiting was not his problem. Trust was. He lowered himself onto one knee and placed his hands flat on the wet asphalt, palms up. The puppy watched him with the kind of attention that very small, very alone creatures develop quickly, total and unblinking. "Not moving," he said quietly. "Take your time." She took 12 minutes. She crossed the alley in a low, cautious arc, stopping twice to look back at the pipe. When she finally reached his hands, she sniffed his knuckles from every angle, then placed both front paws on his wrist and looked up at him as though asking a question she didn't yet know how to phrase. He named her Clover on the drive home because the name was small and unhurried, and it felt like the opposite of everything the last 3 years had been. The house on Adair Drive had been too quiet for those 3 years. Barrett had bought it for the fenced yard, force of habit maybe, or hope, but the yard had stayed empty. The rooms held a couch, a kitchen table, a workbench in the garage, and the particular absence of anyone who knew his middle name. Clover investigated all of it. She found a dish towel on the oven handle and dragged it to the living room floor, where she stood on it with the focused triumph of a general claiming territory. She stepped into her water bowl, backed out, and shook water across the kitchen tile with an expression of complete surprise. She tried 3 times to climb the sofa, failed each time, and on the 4th attempt hooked one paw over the edge and hauled herself up with a grunt that was entirely too large for her body. Barrett watched from the kitchen doorway. When she finally crested the cushion and sat there with her black-masked face turned toward him, proud, slightly damp, waiting, something gave way in his chest that he hadn't known was still held rigid. He laughed. Not the managed polite sound he produced in conversations, but a real one, short and unguarded, the kind that surprised itself on the way out. Clover's good ear rotated toward the sound. She wagged once, carefully, as though she had been waiting to see what that particular sound meant before she committed to a response. That night, Barrett set up a crate beside his bed with a folded blanket inside. Clover ignored it and curled on his old field jacket at the foot of the bed. The jacket he had stopped wearing after Kandahar, the one that had belonged to the same season as Breck. Breck had been a Belgian Malinois, too. 8 years old, trained for explosive detection, partnered with Barrett for his last 3 years of service. On a clear March morning outside a village south of Kandahar, Breck had stopped dead on a dirt track and gone rigid. The alert that meant the ground ahead was not safe. Barrett's team had stopped. The IED had detonated 30 yards ahead of them, triggered remotely, seconds after they'd halted. Breck had been at the front of the column. For 3 years, Barrett had told himself that it was the nature of the work, that Breck had done exactly what he was trained to do, that saving 5 men was not a failure. He had told himself this with the same discipline he brought to everything else. He had never fully believed it. The metal identification tag from Breck's collar lived in the bedside drawer, and Barrett had not found a satisfactory reason to move it. He looked at Clover sleeping on the old jacket, her narrow chest rising and falling, one paw stretched toward the floor. He reached down and touched the top of her head with 2 fingers. "I know," he said softly, to no one he could name. Rain returned before sunrise. By the time Barrett loaded Clover into a basket on the passenger seat and drove toward Cumberland Animal Clinic, the streets were dark and slick and nearly empty. Clover stood in the basket with her paws on the rim, cataloging the smells coming through the vent, with the concentration of someone doing important work. Dr. Audrey Nash met them in the examination room. She was 41, with close-cropped natural hair, brown skin, and hands that animals trusted within seconds of being touched, a thing she had earned over 12 years of practice and not borrowed from bedside manner. She wore clay-colored scrubs and moved with the unhurried precision of someone who understood that panic was contagious, and calm was a clinical tool. "The alley refugee," she said, watching Clover attempt to eat the stethoscope tubing. "She came out voluntarily," Barrett said. "The good ones usually do." Audrey ran her hands along Clover's spine, checked her ears, maybe a little past, underweight but structurally sound. No injuries. She ran the microchip scanner slowly across Clover's shoulders, silence, nothing registered. No owner waiting, no history attached to her. Clover pressed her nose against Barrett's forearm the way a small creature indicates that proximity is acceptable, and it has decided this on its own terms. Barrett had spent years working beside military dogs trained to obey through gunfire, but this puppy had no training, no handler, and no particular reason to trust him. She had chosen his coat in the alley anyway. The weight of that choice had not left him. Outside, he carried Clover against his chest in the crook of his arm. He had taken 4 steps toward his truck when Clover went rigid. Not frightened. Still. The kind of still that meant her full attention had been captured. Across the street, beneath the overhang of a closed insurance office, stood an adult Belgian Malinois. She was 3 years old at most, lean to the point of severity, with a deep black mask and amber eyes that moved between the bundle in Barrett's arms, and the street around her with the practiced alertness of an animal that had stayed alive by treating every unfamiliar thing as a question requiring an answer. A pale scar crossed the outside of her left foreleg, old, healed, but not forgotten. She stood with her weight slightly forward, as if she had already calculated her options and was waiting for additional information before selecting one. Barrett stopped. He lowered himself half a step and angled his body sideways so he wasn't facing her directly. The dog's eyes settled on Clover. Something moved through her posture. Not softening exactly, but a brief interruption in her vigilance, as though she had confirmed something she needed to confirm. Then a delivery truck turned onto the street, and the engine sound brought her head around sharply. She looked east, toward the railroad corridor and the closed industrial blocks past it, with the same directness someone uses to indicate a door. She looked back at Barrett once. Then she was gone, running east at the corner before Barrett had finished processing the movement. Audrey appeared behind him. "Don't chase," she said. He put Clover in the truck and tried anyway. He checked 2 alleys, a parking structure, and the loading zone behind a refrigeration warehouse. Once, at the end of a service road, A dark masked shape slipped between two parked semis. By the time he turned the truck, the road was empty. Back at the clinic, Audrey held her coffee in both hands. "She wasn't afraid of you," she said when Barrett described it. "Fear pulls a dog away from everything at once. She stayed close enough to see Clover, then she ran east. She didn't touch the food you left. Then she wasn't here for food." Audrey looked at the empty intersection. "She came to see the puppy." "She came to see the puppy," Barrett said, then left. Maybe she went back to something. That distinction followed him home. It followed him through the afternoon while Clover reorganized the kitchen, annexed a work glove from the garage, and fell asleep beneath the coffee table with it pressed under her chin. It followed him when he called Audrey at 7 that evening. "A mother dog who eats half and carries the rest away isn't eating for herself," he said. Audrey was quiet a moment. Puppies can't stay alone for very long. "She's been running that route since at least yesterday morning." Barrett, a pause if there's another one. "I'll go east at first light," he said. He started at the rail corridor before 6. The October sky was not yet light, and frost had silvered the tops of the chain-link fences along the track beds. He carried 2 photographs in clear sleeves. One of Clover in his kitchen, ears mismatched, expression improbably solemn, and one he had taken through the truck window of the mother dog standing beneath the insurance office awning. The first lead came from Jerome Watts, a mail carrier doing his early commercial route in a reflective vest and a wool hat pulled low. Jerome was a tall, observant man in his late 40s, with the easy patience of someone who had spent 12 years walking the same streets at the same hours and noticed what changed between visits. He studied both photographs under a streetlight. "That's the dog from behind the depot," he said. "She crosses Depot Street most mornings around 5:30, always moving south to north. Never stops. Last week she had something in her mouth, couldn't make out what." He pointed south toward the old Southern Railway maintenance corridor. "She comes up from that direction." The second lead came from Orson Kettleworth himself. The 73-year-old hardware store owner was a compact man with bifocals he kept pushing up with one finger and the unhurried manner of someone who had been solving practical problems. Long enough that urgency no longer changed his pace. He had seen the dog twice in the alley where Barrett had found Clover, both times before dawn, circling the drainpipe area, then leaving. "Figured she lost something there," Orson said. "Didn't connect it until you showed me the picture." The mother, returning to find the puppy gone, finding nothing, leaving to go back to whatever she had left behind. The clearest picture came from Phyllis Weston, who owned a breakfast place called Second Cup on Western Avenue. Phyllis was 64, broad-shouldered and direct, with silver hair in a braid over one shoulder, and the particular warmth of a woman who had spent 40 years making sure strangers felt fed. She pulled Barrett to a stool at the end of the counter, before he finished his second sentence. "I've been calling her Vale," Phyllis said. "You know her." "She's been coming to my back step since August." Phyllis set a coffee in front of him without being asked. "Leaves food, she waits until I go in, then she eats. First month she cleaned the bowl. Last month she started taking half of it with her, carrying it in her mouth, going north through the lot." She set the photograph back on the counter. "She deserves a name even when she won't let you close enough to say it. Have you seen where she goes? North through my lot leads to the old Calder textile property. Shut down 4 years ago, no one's been in there," she paused. "They're supposed to start site prep Thursday morning. Demolition survey and a crew." Barrett checked his phone. Tuesday. The weather warning had been sitting at the top of his screen since dawn. Hard freeze expected Wednesday night. Temperatures dropping to 22 before sunrise Thursday. 2 days. He left Clover with Audrey and drove north from Second Cup. The old Calder textile mill was 3 stories of brick with steel-framed windows, most still intact. The chain-link fence along the north face had collapsed in 2 places, and the earth of the maintenance road beyond it was soft enough to hold prints, small, layered, adult and puppy, both going north into the building's shadow. Barrett did not go further. He set 2 bowls near the fence gap, backed 40 feet down the maintenance road, and sat on an overturned concrete block until the light failed. He was good at waiting. The problem was not the waiting. The problem was the particular quality of this specific dark, and what it held. He had been here before, not at this fence, but at this moment. The moment when you know something is alive in the dark, and you cannot reach it yet, and every instinct says move, and the only right answer is to stay exactly where you are, and trust the decision you made before your hands wanted action. He came back the next morning to empty bowls. He brought a transport crate from the farm supply store, tied the door open, set food inside the threshold. He sat on the concrete block and waited. The October sky turned from gray to pale white above the brick roofline. Vale appeared at the fence gap at 8:43. She was thinner in person than she had appeared outside the clinic. Her ribs pressed through her coat, and the scar on her foreleg caught the flat morning light. She stood at the gap and assessed the space. The crate, the food, Barrett, the road beyond. With the systematic attention of an animal that had survived by treating every unfamiliar thing as a potential threat until it demonstrated otherwise. She turned and disappeared back through the gap. Barrett did not move. 12 minutes later she returned, and this time she was not alone. The puppy came through the gap behind her, smaller than Clover, with the same black mask but more tan in his face, and both ears still folded softly outward. He moved behind Vale's left flank the way a puppy learns to move when it has understood too early that the world can change whenever its mother walks away. He was alive and thin, and he had been waiting here alone in the dark on every cold morning since his mother left to search for food, returning each time with something in her mouth, and the same steady presence that told him the world was still ordered. Barrett felt something shift in him that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with what grief eventually becomes when it has nowhere left to go. He sat on the concrete block and did not move for an hour and 40 minutes. Vale watched him from the fence gap. Eventually, she crossed the maintenance road to the bowls, ate briefly, carried a portion back to the puppy. She did not approach the crate. The next morning, Barrett brought Clover. He set her down 15 feet from the gap and unclipped her leash. The puppy's head appeared instantly at the gap. Both young dogs froze. Then Clover moved forward in the low, careful arc that young dogs use when they want contact without causing alarm, and the puppy, who had been alone in the dark for 3 days while his mother crossed the city on his behalf, stepped through the fence and ran. They met in the middle of the maintenance road, and the reunion was immediate and graceless and complete. Clover pawed at his face. He grabbed her ear. They tumbled sideways against a piece of drainage tile, and neither of them cared about anything except that the other one was here. A small sound escaped from the smaller puppy. Not quite a bark, not quite a cry, something older than either, and Clover answered it by pressing her whole face against his. Vale stood at the fence gap and watched. Barrett sat on the concrete block with his shoulders angled aside and waited. 20 minutes passed. Vale crossed the maintenance road and ate completely from both bowls. Then she walked to the crate, placed one paw on the threshold, tested the frame with her nose along both sides. She looked at the puppies. She looked at Barrett. She walked to the far end of the crate, sniffed the blanket inside, and sat down beside it. Not inside. Beside. Barrett took what he was given. On the third morning, Wednesday, ice storm moving down from the northeast, temperature at 29 at 7 a.m. Barrett arrived to find the first surveying stakes already in the ground along the south face of the mill property. A contractor's truck sat idling at the far end of the lot. He set the crate in its usual position, moved the food inside, sat on the concrete block with his hands visible and cold and open. Vale came through the gap at 7:19. She moved with the directness of an animal that had made its decision in the night. She ate from the bowl inside the crate, backed up, circled once, and walked in. She turned around inside and lay down. Barrett crossed the 20 feet of ground between them without rushing, placed his hand on the crate door, and held it partially closed for 10 seconds. He opened it again. Vale lifted her head but did not rise. He repeated the motion. The door traveled farther. On the third attempt he closed it slowly until the latch touched the frame. Vale did not rise. She pressed her nose against the wire grating and looked at the puppies, still tumbling over each other in the maintenance road, as if she needed to see them one more time before she could fully believe she had made the right choice. The latch settled into place. No one said anything. The contractor truck idled at the far end of the lot, unaware. Phyllis Weston had driven up in her station wagon, while Barrett was running his third approach on the crate door, a dog bed visible through the rear window. She had been feeding Vale for 3 months, she told him afterward, and she was not interested in missing the ending. The smaller puppy, the one who had spent 3 nights alone in an old mill waiting for his mother to come back, climbed into Phyllis's lap on their first meeting and stayed there. She named him Porter, for the side door of the diner where Vale used to wait in the early dark. Barrett took Vale and Clover home. He put Vale in the mudroom with the door to the yard, food, water, and time. For 2 days she inspected the perimeter every hour, checked both puppies through the gate, checked the hallway beyond. On the 3rd morning, Barrett found her asleep on the mat beside the washing machine with one ear raised and the other, for the first time, fully at rest. Audrey said Vale had been living at the edge of her reserves for months. "She needs somewhere she can stop being the thing keeping everything alive," she said. In the careful way she said things that mattered. Edwin and Ruth Alderton were retired schoolteachers in their late 60s who had been on the clinic's adoption list for 8 months. Ruth had come in twice to say she didn't want a puppy. She wanted a companion, not a project. Edwin had said only that they had a quiet house with a lot of afternoon light, and that a dog who needed either of those things was welcome to both. They met Vale in the clinic's small garden on a Tuesday, sitting on a bench without calling to her or reaching toward her. Ruth kept her hands in her lap. Edwin spoke to Barrett in a low, unhurried voice about something entirely unrelated, which turned out to be the most useful thing anyone could have done. It allowed Vale to study them without feeling watched. On their second visit, Vale walked to the bench and stood beside it for 3 minutes. Then she lay down at Ruth's feet. She did not look back at the door. Barrett signed the adoption paperwork on a Thursday. Clover tried to steal the pen. Audrey held it out of reach and slid the forms across the exam table, and Clover put both front paws on Barrett's boot and sat there with her mismatched ears. One straight, one curved, looking up at him with the patient certainty of an animal who had already settled every question that mattered and was simply waiting for him to catch up. He signed his name. He thought about the alley behind Kettleworth's building supply and the concrete block outside the Calder mill, and the way Vale had looked at him before she walked into the crate. Not asking for permission, but acknowledging that he had been worth the wait. He thought about Breck and the dirt track south of Kandahar, and the years he had spent believing that surviving without the right ending was a form of failure. Clover tugged his sleeve. He folded the paperwork and put it in his jacket pocket. Ruth sent a photograph 6 days later. Vale was asleep across the full length of the living room sofa, with Edwin's hand resting lightly on her back. She was not braced for departure. She was not listening for sounds from another room. She looked for the first time since Barrett had seen her beneath that insurance office awning, like a creature whose only remaining job was to be warm. Phyllis texted every few days about Porter, each message attached to a photograph of a puppy growing faster than the diner's supply of dish towels. Barrett drove by Second Cup on Sunday mornings now, something he hadn't planned and then simply did, because Clover recognized Phyllis's voice from half a block away and began talking with her whole body before they'd even parked. The 4 of them moved through the same 1.5 miles of Knoxville. On clear mornings, Barrett walked Clover along the river greenway, and sometimes Phyllis would be coming the other direction with Porter on a leash he treated as a suggestion. The 2 dogs ran in converging circles around the adults, tangled their leashes, and did not care. Phyllis said it was chaos every Sunday. She came every Sunday anyway. One morning, Barrett opened the kitchen drawer for a spatula and found Clover's rabies tag lying beside Breck's identification tag. She had worked her own tag free from her collar the day before, and he'd set it there, meaning to reattach it. The 2 tags lay side by side in the drawer, one that had meant loss, one that meant he had stayed. He reattached Clover's tag to her collar and left the other one where it was. There is a thing that happens sometimes, not loudly, when you have been carrying grief long enough that it has become part of your weight, and you have forgotten what you felt like before it. You don't put it down all at once. It simply stops being the heaviest thing. You reach for it one morning and find something else has been placed there instead. Something that woke you up by pulling on your blanket, that is waiting now by the back door, that has decided you are worth following from room to room, and has not changed its mind in all the weeks since. Barrett opened the back door. The yard he hadn't used in 3 years was waiting in the November morning, cold and quiet and full of leaves. Clover would need to investigate. She went through the door like she had been launched, and the yard received her. And Barrett stood on the step with his coffee and watched her go. God does not always send comfort in the forms we were expecting. Sometimes it arrives wet and shaking at the end of a drain pipe, and it places its paws on your hands, and it asks a question you won't understand until much later. Not what will you do for me, but what are you still capable of becoming? The answer, it turns out, is more than you believed when you were carrying the grief alone. It is enough to fill a yard. It is enough to make the house on Adair Drive sound different in the morning than it did the night before. If this story reached something in you, share it with someone who needs it today. Leave your city in the comments so we know where hope is watching from, and subscribe to Paws of Courage for more stories about the lives that find each other in the rain.